Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Stonehearth for PC and Mac. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a colony building game developed by Radiant Entertainment, and it was released in full in 2018 for PC and Mac after having gone through a period of early access as well as a successful Kickstarter campaign that met several stretch goals. And from there things get kind of messy, because after the 1.0 release, they did throw in a few updates after that, but eventually stopped development on the game entirely, in no small part because Riot Games, the developer and publisher of stuff like League of Legends, acquired the studio, and the developers' priorities shifted to whatever they were working on over at Riot. This left several of the Kickstarter promises, namely the stretch goals, unfulfilled. Stuff like the Linux port, as well as stuff like the Magmasmith job for Hearthlings, or PvP, or additional biomes and things like that. And while they did explain the process behind cutting many of these features, it still meant that you had a bunch of unfulfilled Kickstarter promises that the backers were not necessarily enthused about. That said, what ultimately was made available to the public was generally decently received, and as part of an odd maneuver, the developer ended up basically turning the game over to the community. They have something called the ACE mod, which stands for Authorized Community Expansion, which is not only endorsed by the developers, but was actually part of the game's installation at one point. There was a time when it would automatically subscribe you to the Steam Workshop collection for it, and it would just automatically install the ACE mod for you. Now, it seems like that was part of an update they pushed to the game, so it only seemed to work for people who already had the game installed. I installed it fresh and it didn't have the ACE mod automatically subscribed, but needless to say, it was easy to just go onto the workshop and subscribe to that mod. And that's what you'll be seeing throughout this video, although I did play the game vanilla quite a bit as well. That does, of course, bring up the question of what exactly am I doing with this review, because if you've seen my video on mods before, you know that Stonehearth was the main reason I ended up doing another video talking about my channel's policy on mods. Well, in this particular case, since the developers basically turned the game over to the community and specifically endorsed the ACE mod, there's really no reason not to play it with the ACE mod. This complicates the reviewing process. After all, what exactly do I review? Do I review the game purely vanilla, exactly as the developers released it to the public, or do I review what they intend for you to play at this point, which is the game including the ACE mod? Well, in case you can't tell by what's going on with this video already, I'm doing both. I'm going to basically review this game as I normally would in its vanilla form and do a full assessment of it, and then after that, I'll talk about the ACE mod and what that brings to the table. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get things started. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which uses a very heavily stylized, blocky art style that is, I think, meant to look kind of like voxels, but they're not really voxels per se. But everything is still bright and colorful and a bit cartoony, and overall the art style, while certainly being a bit out there, actually works pretty well for the game overall. That said, while the game does look pretty good, it does have some pretty nasty issues on the technical side of things. You might look at the system requirements versus the recommended specs and think, wow, that's really not all that bad. But keep in mind, I'm running this on an i7-4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 1080. And apart from the RAM, which meets the recommended specifications, everything else in my system is well above recommended specs. And all that really means is that I can get away with playing the game longer before the performance degrades so much that it becomes barely playable. It has some pretty serious issues with performance degradation over time. The larger your settlement becomes, the more settlers you have, the more the performance degrades, which on one hand does make sense because there's more being computed, but on the other hand, it's degrading from around 100 frames per second on my rig when the game first starts out to 20 FPS or less once you hit the larger settlement sizes. And while there are some ways to help mitigate the performance degradation to some degree, and that's why, for example, I disabled the shadows in the game, because it does have shadows, but they significantly impact performance, so I disabled them, and I noticed that the game ran a lot better, so I just left them off. But even aside from adjusting graphics settings, there are a few other things that you can do to at least try to mitigate some of those performance problems. That said, there's only so much that organizing all of your resources in containers and minimizing the amount of structures that you build will actually do. Not to mention, it's not exactly the most stable of games either. I did have some crashing issues, which thankfully I was able to circumvent a bit by saving the game, quitting out of it, and then loading it back up fresh so it basically clears out the memory, and that did help a bit. But it didn't completely eliminate that problem, and it also didn't eliminate the problems that I kept running into with glitches. Namely things like the AI glitching out, which is a relatively common thing, and it's to the point where they even outright tell you to use the console command to teleport characters whenever they get stuck. Which can and does happen quite frequently, but it's thankfully easy to fix with the teleport command, because all you need to do is click on the character, and then go into the console, type in teleport, hit enter, and then click somewhere where you want them to be teleported to, so their AI will start processing again. And most of the glitches I encountered were basically that sort of thing. Stuff that was just mildly annoying, but relatively easy to work around or outright fix. So, thankfully the glitches aren't that bad, but the performance and the stability definitely should have been sorted out before the development team stopped working on the project. Because even though the developers did follow through on their promise to make the game very moddable, they haven't made the source code available, which is something that would be really required for the modding community to be able to go in there and optimize routines and make sure that the game is more stable and also runs better. So even though the game does look pretty decent, it has some pretty serious issues that you really can't overlook. But then we move over into sound design, and that's where things are mostly fine, actually. The sound effects are nothing particularly impressive, but they're not particularly bad either, so they just do their job pretty decently. And while there's no voice acting, the soundtrack is done with a pretty nice fantasy style that fits the game very well, so they've at the very least got good sound design going on for this type of game at least. But when you do bring all of that presentation together, you end up with a hell of a mixed bag. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and there's really not a whole lot of story in this game other than some basic setup, which is that you select your faction of pioneers to go into a new area and create a settlement. And that's pretty much it. There are a few things that help to differentiate the three factions a bit, although they all function more or less the same. By the end of it all, you are going to have access to all of the same job classes for your settlers, it's just that the orders are changed up a bit, and they're optimized a bit differently depending on which biome that particular faction is really meant to be played on. To that end, you have a faction that's meant to be played on the forest environment, you have one that's meant to be played on the desert environment, and you have one that is meant to be played on the Arctic environment. The one set up for the forest environment is your standard fantasy kingdom, where it's basically set up like medieval Europe, and you are going to be focusing on carpentry to start with, and you are gradually going to unlock things like masonry, and you're also going to rely pretty heavily on farming. If you go to the desert faction, it's set up for pottery first, so you're going to be working with clay an awful lot, especially for building materials, because there's basically no wood to be found anywhere in the desert, and you focus primarily on shepherding for your food source. Then there is the faction set up for the Arctic, where it focuses primarily on trapping and hunting for its food source, as well as stone crafting for construction. Regardless of which faction you're playing, you're going to eventually have access to all of the same job types, it's just that they're ordered in different ways, so you might gain access to carpentry much later with certain factions, whereas with the forest-oriented faction, you start out with it immediately. They do try to give each of the factions a bit of flavor as well. For example, the desert-dwelling faction is set up basically like a merchant society, whereas the Arctic-based culture is styled more after Norse culture. But while each faction does have a bit of flavor to it, and it does change the aesthetics of all of your characters and the preset building designs, the only real effect it has on gameplay is just determining which order you're going to be going about the various job classes in, at least to start with. There's no faction interactions or diplomacy or anything like that you really need to worry about, other than just the occasional demand from goblin tribes and such like that, but those happen regardless of which faction you're playing, and so whichever one you choose is really just a matter of personal preference more than anything else. And while the game does have some story in the sense that there are certain event chains that will eventually pop up, they don't really have all that much bearing on what you're actually doing. You really don't have to go out of your way to complete those event chains. And really, you're going to be far more concerned about the mechanical implications of those event chains than anything else. This is a very mechanics-forward game. So, what exactly are the mechanics of Stonehearth? Well, when you start the game off, you select your faction, and you select the biome you're going to be embarking on, and then you're given a selection of 5 randomly generated characters that will be your initial settlers. And if you don't like their stats, or their personalities, or their appearance, or a combination thereof, then you can continue messing around with those and adjust their appearance as you like, as well as randomize their stats and personalities. Once you've selected all of your pioneers, then it's time to select what your starting equipment is going to be and select a spot on the randomly generated map to embark upon and set your settlement up in. And like with the pioneers themselves, you can randomly generate as many worlds as you want before you get a map that you particularly like, although they're all going to be fairly similar within their given biomes. After you embark, you select a spot to set down the hearth as well as your town flag, and then the real gameplay begins, where you basically just need to set up your settlement and provide for your pioneers. You need to make sure they're all fed, you need to make sure that they have a place to sleep, and you need to make sure they have a way of defending themselves against invaders. Every settler starts with the basic worker class, which allows them to build structures, harvest materials such as stone and wood, pick up and carry things to and from stockpiles, and mine out areas, whether that be just mining out some ground so you can lay down foundations, or delving into the earth somewhere to find further resources. But as a worker class, they're not able to produce anything, so you want to assign them a production job, whether that be something like a carpenter, or a mason, or a cook, or a shepherd, or a farmer, or something along those lines. Once a character has a more advanced job than worker, they will start leveling up in that job, which will gradually give them access to new crafting recipes and give them more capabilities with their given job, like they'll work faster, for example. And as they level up, they'll also gain access to additional job types. For example, when you're playing as the forest-based faction, you'll start out with the ability to make a carpenter. Eventually, they'll gain access to a crafting recipe for a mason's hammer and chisel. That will allow someone to become a mason. When a mason has reached at least level 2, they will be able to make a potter's cutter, which is the tool required to promote a character into a potter. And the mason of level 2 can then become a potter of level 1 and start producing pottery. The same sort of thing holds true for combat classes as well. As a character levels up in the basic footman class, for example, with the Forest Kingdom again, then eventually they will gain access to the archer class, and once they've leveled up enough in that, they'll eventually gain access to the knight class. Obviously, unlike crafting classes, these don't have anything to do with production of goods. They'll just walk around and defend the town from any invading threats, and thus the combat classes are really organized more by their actual capabilities than anything else. A basic footman, for example, is your basic infantry. They go up and they whack things. Then, of course, the archer hangs back and shoots at enemies from a distance, and the knight is meant as the heavily armored tank kind of class that goes in and takes all the damage for the entire group, and eventually gains the ability to inspire them to give them some extra combat bonuses. There's also a Cleric class you can eventually unlock once you have a capable herbalist, and as you might expect, they're basically the healer. Now obviously, there are way too many job classes for your initial party of 5 to fill all the roles up, so you need to attract new settlers. How do you do that? Well, it's very simple. All you need to do is have a certain amount of food and a certain amount of overall wealth in your particular settlement, and when the next day rolls around, then it gives you a daily update that allows you to accept a new settler into your settlement. As your settlement continues to expand and you're able to keep your people happy, which is of course making sure they're all fed, make sure they all have comfortable beds, make sure they're all eating off of tables and sitting at nice chairs when they're eating, and make sure their town looks pretty nice, then you will also gradually gain access to overall town upgrades. You'll start with a banner upgrade, and then eventually be able to upgrade your hearth, and finally, once everything is going very well, then you'll be able to upgrade your entire township with a monument dedication. Whenever it comes time to select one of these, you'll be given a choice between 3 different options, each of which has their own specific bonuses that you might be interested in having. For example, one of the banners allows you to summon monsters to fight, whereas the other 2 banners are focused more on farming and crafting respectively. The one focused on farming increases the rate at which your crops grow, and the one that is centered on crafting gives you a higher rate of finding ore when you're mining. While the specific bonus that each of these provides is locked in once you've selected it, when it comes time to select the next upgrade for your town, you're given the next selection of 3 options. It doesn't lock you into one specific path there. So if you find out that your town is lacking in one particular area, then you might select an upgrade that helps to mitigate that issue. Or you might just do whatever you want, because to be perfectly honest with you, it is so ridiculously easy to maintain everything and provide for your hearthlings that you never really need to worry about any of this. Really, the main thing you're going to need to worry about is the sheer amount of storage containers you're going to need to properly organize all of your various resources, which you will be basically swimming in once you get further on into the game. This is in no small part where the performance degradation comes from as well, because you just have this constantly ballooning amount of resources and constructed items and such like that, and as such, the game actually implements limits on that by default, so that the game doesn't just start crashing on you. And that limit applies to both the number of hearthlings you can have in your settlement, as well as the amount of items that you can have in that settlement. And the problem is that the limits are so low that you'll hit those limits extremely quickly, and your hearthlings will just stop producing things. Which can be a problem if most of the items are just resources or things like chairs or stuff like that. So then you're left with a decision. Do you remove that limit and just deal with the performance degradation and potential crashing, or do you leave the limit on and just run out of stuff right when your settlement is starting to get to the good stuff? Obviously, you're going to disable the limits. Of course, it does still have an upper bound to the number of hearthlings you can have, which is 30, but at least you don't have to worry about hearthlings just standing around doing nothing anymore because there's just too many logs in your inventory. Although that's certainly not the only reason they'll just be standing around doing nothing. Sometimes the AI glitches out and they just get stuck in a particular location and you had to use that teleport command like I mentioned before to get them unstuck. But other times, they'll just stop working on a building and a section of it will be highlighted in red, saying that your hearthlings don't know how to build that thing, even if there's absolutely nothing in the way that might be preventing them from doing that. And while this doesn't happen all that often if you happen to be using the pre-made templates that come with the game, if you're building your own structures, it can happen quite frequently, especially if you try to get interesting with the actual structures. Because even though one of the very cool things this game brings to the table is the ability to build completely custom structures the way you really like them in full 3D with multiple Z levels, unfortunately, because half the time it tends to highlight things in red and make it unbuildable, you'll end up being frustrated more often than not with the actual building process. And that even extends to using the pre-made templates, where the game comes with several templates that allow you to build structures based on the individual faction you're playing as aesthetic, and it constructs them in a very specific order, so if you don't happen to have a particular item or your crafter is not high enough level to make that item, then the building's construction will just stop, and it will wait until that particular item is available, which, needless to say, gets pretty irritating. It also really doesn't help that you can't order your Hearthlings around directly unless they are combat classes. If they're any of the crafters or any of the standard workers, then the best you can really hope for is to limit the jobs that they're able to do so that they focus on only crafting things or only mining or only hauling or whatever the case may be. For crafting queues, you can sort of drag the items around so that you can at least try to prioritize certain items by just having them first in the queue, but even then, that doesn't always work. So a lot of the time it feels like you're trying to herd cats, although thankfully because the game is so easy, it never really ends up being that big of a deal. Now sure, once you get later on in the game and you start encountering some of the late game enemies and such like that, then the difficulty of combat certainly ratchets up, but by that point you've got a pretty well decked out army and you've got a pretty well decked out settlement, so you shouldn't really have too many problems with it. The end result of all of this is that even though the game is mostly functional, and it does have some good ideas in there, and if you are a fan of colony sims or colony builders, you'll probably find something to like here, the entire thing is basically just an exercise in tempered expectations at absolute best. It doesn't give you that feeling of boundless possibilities like you get with something like, say, Dwarf Fortress or RimWorld, and because it's very lacking in simulation elements, it's definitely not a proper colony sim, it's a colony builder. And while there's nothing wrong with it just being a colony builder, it is a fairly bare-bones colony builder, and it definitely feels unfinished, especially considering that they have concept art for things that just weren't included in the game in the menu. Like the Magma Smith, for example, which is a job class that they just cut out of the game entirely because they didn't even implement magma and didn't even really know what they wanted to do with it. And as is a problem with a lot of these colony builder type games, it doesn't really have an end game to speak of. Your end game is selecting some settlers so you can start a new settlement. And I wish I were joking there, but that's literally what the game does. Once your colony hits a certain point of prosperity, it'll basically confirm that there's not really anything left for you to do other than just keep playing the same settlement and notice the same invasions and occasionally get merchant caravans coming in just to trade with for a bit, none of which are visible on the map, by the way. They're just text boxes that show you the various items that you can purchase and sell. But I digress. It'll let you select some of your current settlers and then basically do a sort of new game plus where you can go to a new area and create a new settlement and basically start the whole process over again. But there's really nothing else to it. There's not really any major opportunities that open up after you've reached the higher levels of town prosperity, except for you get some new building templates and a few new things that you can construct. Now, of course, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that per se, but it is fairly underwhelming overall, and that's what I would really describe the experience of Stonehearth as in general. It's a very underwhelming game. That certainly doesn't mean it's a bad game, but it is painfully obvious that it released in an unfinished state no matter what the developers told us. It's a fairly bare-bones release that ultimately just nets a 2.5 out of 5 on my scale. It might be worth playing if you're a fan of colony builders and are willing to put up with the game's problems in order to get to the stuff that does actually work, because when it does work, it can be fairly fun. But if you're looking for something with more substance to it, something that's more along the lines of a proper colony sim, or something that's just much more fleshed out in general, then you might want to look elsewhere, especially considering that this game never goes on sale anymore. It's not an overly expensive game to begin with, it's $20 US, or whatever your regional equivalent is, but from what I can tell, the last time it went on sale was in 2019, so if you're gonna try to get into this thing, you're gonna be paying its full price of $20. And that's gonna basically be $20 for a game that is blatantly unfinished and which the modding community more or less had to finish for the developers, which of course brings me to the ACE mod. Now that stands for Authorized Community Expansion, and since it was officially endorsed by the developers, you can basically say that it's the way they really intend for you to play the game at this point. So what exactly does the ACE mod do? Well, it's basically an attempt to finish the game. It's supposed to add in some features that were directly cut out of the game before its final release, and it also adds a few things of its own in there as well. So there are new resources to mess around with. There's an entirely new biome known as the Highlands, which is intended to be the home of the new Dwarven faction, which still isn't in the mod pack yet, but they are working on it. It was a feature that was intended to be in the original game, but the developers cut out because they apparently couldn't figure out how to make underground dwelling work. Not sure exactly what was going on there, but whatever. Other things the A.C.E mod does are add in some extra variety with some new items to craft, as well as some visual changes to further differentiate each of the factions, and it also introduces irrigation and fluid control mechanics, an overhaul to the military gear and unit control, and even overhauls some of the crafters and the fuel system in its entirety, so now you have multiple grades of fuel which have different efficiency levels. In all, it's a pretty substantial overhaul to the game that really does make it feel like a much more polished experience, even though it is a fair bit buggier and a bit more crash-prone with the A.C.E mod installed and functioning. Of course, it doesn't really fix any of the major issues that are present in the game, like the performance or the stability, and certainly not the AI issues, but it does go a long way toward making Stonehearth not feel like a blatantly unfinished product, so it does have that going for it. And as such, if you are going to play Stonehearth, I would definitely recommend doing so with the A.C.E mod. But it's still impossible to ignore that this game was ultimately abandoned by its developers. Not necessarily because they wanted to abandon it, but because they more or less had to. And even with that caveat, I really can't shake the feeling of disgust that the developers basically are relying on the community to finish the game for them. I mean, if this didn't have the stability issues or the massive performance degradation, and it had all of the features they actually promised during the Kickstarter, it could have been one hell of a colony builder. But instead, we end up with yet another example of a Kickstarter project that promised too much and ended up under-delivering. So, I just can't really recommend the game outright unless you are really willing to put up with a lot of issues. Thank you all very much for watching. And if you like my content, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.